Our guests joining us on tonight's Spotlight are former Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal Matthew Fogg, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, Gerald Horne, who's with us from Houston, Texas. Well, let's start off with Mr. Horne in Houston. Welcome to the program here on Press TV Spotlight. This report found that between 1980 and 2018, more than 55% of deaths from police violence, that's over 17,000 in total, were either misclassified or went unreported. Plain and simple, is this a cover-up?
It is a cover-up. It's a tragedy. It's also a crime against humanity. As you may know, the Black community through our organizations have been clamoring for a United Nations human rights investigation of this quasi-genocidal pattern that has been inflicted upon the Black community. And I urge and encourage the international community to move with all due deliberate speed to intervene, because what's going on cannot be allowed to continue. You should also know that in today's newspapers, there was another stunning article about the fact that as of 2020 alone, there were 70,000 cases of missing Black girls, girls under the age of 18. Where have they gone? Where have they disappeared to? At the same time, Black children only are 14% of the nation's children population, but they're 31% of the children that are missing. What's going on in the United States is obviously an outgrowth of slavery. It's obviously an outgrowth of the unresolved issues that followed slavery, speaking of the hated apartheid system known as Jim Crow. And you should know that that system only began to retreat because of international pressure. And I dare say that today's tragedies will likewise only retreat under unremitting international pressure.
Matthew Fogg in Washington, D.C. Do you agree with Mr. Horne? This is an effort to conceal the truth. Even so, the figures are still too high anyways, aren't they?
Oh, the figures are staggering. I mean, when you look at the numbers of the percentage of African Americans that live in the United States, and you're talking about the numbers, the disproportionate numbers of those that are missing or having some type of a negative impact in their life, it's crazy. I mean, yes, I agree 100%. Till this country recognizes that it has a racial issue that is perpetuated from slavery and all the way back, and that the country is still very much divided on this issue, we're going to have problems. It's definitely in law enforcement, that's for sure.
Let's go back to Mr. Horne. The study, it discovers that Black Americans are 3.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white Americans, and Hispanic people are killed at a ratio of 1.8 times higher than non-Hispanic white people. The review of data shows that many fatal police encounters are misclassified, but often, it's most often when the victim is Black or Hispanic. Again, the minorities here bear the brunt of all this. Tell us more, please.
Well, it's interesting. The study that you mentioned references killings by the police. But keep in mind, there are other cases that even this study, as significant and profound as it is, did not encompass. Recall that just a few years ago, not far from where I'm sitting in Houston, Texas, there was the case of the young Black woman, Sandra Bland, who was pulled over by the police because of a traffic violation, was taken to jail, and apparently was so harassed and so traumatized by being in prison that she hung herself. So that would be classified as a suicide, although it's fair to say that the proximate cause of her death was her maltreatment and mistreatment by the police. You should also know that just recently in the US Congress in Washington, D.C., there was an attempt to pass a change in the law, the so-called George Floyd Policing Act. You referenced George Floyd, the Black man in May 2020 in Minnesota, who was killed on camera at the hands, or I should say at the knee, on the neck, administered by a Minnesota police officer. But what's striking is that the Republican Party, the opposition party, did not negotiate in good faith. they basically claimed in a demagogic fashion that if the federal government wants to hold back funds to police departments that use chokeholds, which is an illegal way to restrain a potential suspect, which oftentimes leads to that suspect's death, or if the police department continues to use no-knock warrants, that's when the police don't knock on the door. They just come through your door without knocking and start shooting anybody who resists. The Republicans claim that if you try to restrain and cut off funds from police departments who use such crazy tactics, that's something that will not go down well with them. And so the bill died. And so presumably, police departments are still authorized in many cities to use chokeholds, to use no-knock warrants, and this will continue to cause an escalation and rise of the deaths of citizens, particularly Black American citizens.
Matthew Fogg, past studies have analyzed underreporting of fatal police incidents and how Black Americans disproportionately die from police violence. But those previous researches, they were conducted over much shorter time periods. This report, it covered 40 years. Do you believe that the manner of conduct has been the same basically for decades?
Well, I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I've also been a police expert on law enforcement race issues for about 20 years. I've won a major case against the U.S. Department of Justice myself, fighting racism internally behind the blue wall of silence. I've been there. I've seen how officers can conduct themselves in ways that certainly is not part of our training, but it becomes a culture once you get on the job. And the problem is within law enforcement, and yes, the report is 100% hitting on. I mean, this goes way back. Like I said, for all of the years that I've been in the U.S. Marshals and was a member in law enforcement, worked with dragnet operations all over the country, I had a chance to actually see it in place. And I'm with an organization like right behind me called Blacks in Government, and I'm also was the front page of a news article on my other side that says Bigots with Badges, which is my book that's coming out. But the bottom line is this: racism is infiltrated. The FBI came out and did a report and indicated how many of these subversive, these very, we'll call right-wing racist groups have infiltrated law enforcement. So it is a problem in America. It goes all the way back to the Hoover administration, back when Hoover over the FBI. I mean, we know that law enforcement has been a tool that has been used to actually, as Chief Justice Warren said, who's now deceased, he said the police officer is more powerful than the president of the United States because they have a right to forfeit a person's freedom, their property, or their life at any given time, according on what they perceive their discretion. So this is a problem, and it's a problem that we have to address in America. I've tried to do it with my job. I didn't become one of those police officers that waited until I retired, but I took on the system right when I was there and actually saw these things that we're talking about now, the chokeholds and the, what happened with George Floyd. And we go even New York City Police Department when the mayor de Blasio spoke out about telling his black sons to be careful, and the whole half the police department turned their backs on him. So it is a problem in America, and I think right now with the whole issue of Black Lives Matter, these reports that are coming out, it's saying that this is just not conjured up stuff, but this is real, and we're gonna have to figure out a way to deal with it, whether it's in Congress or whether it's marching, but it's gotta be dealt with.
Mr. Horn, the study brings forth a grim reality here. Despite years of scrutiny, criticism, protests, calls for reform, no government agency tracks how often law enforcement officers in America kill people. Now, if that's the case, how can anyone ever follow up on these findings or pursue a path that leads somewhere in terms of making a change?
Well, that's a very good question. However, your audience should know that The Guardian, the London-based newspaper, interestingly enough, has been trying to keep statistics and figures on how many people are killed by the police in the United States of America, because obviously there are authorities in the United States of America that are not interested in collecting such data, because I assume they feel that it would be indicting them. Also, the Washington Post in the United States of America has tried as well to keep such figures. But to follow up on what your guest said, studies have shown that in Los Angeles, the second largest metropolis in the United States of America, in the sheriff's department, you have right-wing gangs that prey upon black men in particular, and even have certain kinds of games that they play to show that they have basically harassed or otherwise intimidated or worse, injured or maimed black men in particular. Obviously, this is a cofactor on the skyrocketing incarceration rates of black men in particular, although the rates for black women also are escalating sharply. The United States probably imprisons a higher percentage of its population than any other nation on planet Earth. And then there's the death penalty. Black people are more likely to be subjected to the death penalty, subjected to execution by the state, and they're more likely to be executed if they kill a white person than if they kill a person who is not defined as white. Now, obviously, this is outrageous. It should not be allowed to stand. But once again, I think that we'll need pressure from the international community in order for this system of inequality, this staggering crime against humanity, to somehow cease.
Matthew Fogg, let's talk about, Mr. Horn just mentioned the issue of the judicial system. Let's talk about the much seen police impunity in black deaths. As seen time and time again, the judicial system is mostly in favor of the police, especially if the victims, especially if the police are white, the victims are of a community of color. Why is this common practice in U.S. courts?
Well, it just shows how systemic racism is. I mean, it just shows you that across the board. I mean, again, I challenge the U.S. Department of Justice, most powerful law enforcement probably organization in the world, because we as U.S. Marshals work under them. I challenged it for race discrimination. In 1998, I got a landmark verdict that said racism was systemic within the U.S. Marshals, and today I'm the class agent representing over 1,500 black U.S. Marshals, the same type of thing that is going on today. So what we have, we say if it's happening internally, if I got to deal with a bigot with a badge working next to me, imagine what they're going to do to the public. So reality of it is that, yes, the court systems, everybody's in on it. And the reality of it is that until it becomes an issue in America where we start to address it, start to talk about it, it somewhat came out once this past administration and we started having Black Lives Matter and people started marching in the street. Then all of a sudden, that's where the George Floyd Protection Act came out. Now, the organization I'm with, Blacks in Government, we actually did a resolution and we passed that resolution telling Congress we supported the George Floyd Protection Act. But it's so much more because what has happened is we're now beginning to see how entrenched America is on these issues. And as these reports come out, people are now asking the question, well, how can this be in America when we're supposed to be a land that says we're the country of the free? We have to address the fact that in law enforcement, like I said, I'm an expert on the inside. I know what we do. And what I'm saying is, and the culture is such that when you speak up, you become a whistleblower. Actually, you become the bad guy. Once you start speaking up and saying, this has got to stop, it's got to end. We did the same thing with the war on drugs. We took the war on drugs and we built one of the largest prison industrial complexes the world has ever seen, but mainly on the backs of African Americans. When I started noticing that, I brought that up to my managers. I said, listen, we're gonna stop going in the urban areas and making arrests. We're gonna start going into some of these more affluent areas, these white areas, these areas where the most drugs and the best stuff comes from. He said, Fogg, if you go into those locations and you do that, he said, what's gonna happen? They're gonna have pushback. They're gonna contact their congressman, their lawyer, their judge, whoever. He said, and then next thing you know, they're gonna shut our operation down. So we have to understand it is internally. There are a lot of police officers, a lot of people recognize it. We see it. You don't have to wait for a report. You can actually see the studies and you can look around you and see who actually goes to prison for these crimes and who don't, who gets a break or whatever, or privilege we call it in America. So it is a problem.
All right, Gerald Horn, researchers, they identified places where misclassification of the deaths often occurred, noting that medical examiners or coroners who must fill out the cause of death when there's suspicion of foul play, including police violence, they can be embedded in or work for the police departments. Now, if the medical examiner, a coroner, or other certifier fails to indicate police involvement in the cause of death on the death certificate, the incident, it could be misclassified. How concerning are these findings?
Well, it's extremely concerning. And what you just mentioned points to a structural problem, a structural flaw in the criminal justice system. It's not only that the coroners and the medical examiners oftentimes work hand in glove with the police departments. These are their comrades, these are their colleagues, and they're very unlikely to present data that might be indicting of their comrades and colleagues. The same holds true for the prosecuting authorities. That is to say, prosecuting authorities are reluctant to bring criminal cases against police officers who break the law because they too work hand in glove. They too see the police officers as their comrades and colleagues. And then you turn to the law itself. Right now, in many jurisdictions in the United States of America, you have this regulation or law called qualified immunity. What that means is that a police officer, generally speaking, can kill, steal, or rape and not necessarily be found liable if someone wants to sue them for damages. It's also unlikely, I'm afraid to say, for them to be found guilty of a crime because of the structure of the law. Once again, we can't begin to understand this outrage unless you understand the system of slavery, unless you begin to understand that system, which basically equated Black people with being akin to horses, mules, and cattle, not part of the human family. And to this very day, there is that lingering idea that Black people are not part of the human family. And since there has not been a sufficient interrogation, not to mention excoriation of that particular canard, that lie, that outrage, the system continues to persist.
And one quick question, get a final thought from Matthew Fogg. We were talking about the issue of medical examiners and coroners. The practices are showing that racism is occurring not just during the encounter itself, but even after the individual has passed away. Does this show how deeply embedded systemic racism is in different aspects of American life, most notably in issues pertaining to health?
Well, as someone said, is walking, breathing, driving while Black, and death while Black. And yes, I mean, the reality of it is that the country has not relinquished its past, and it continues to hold on to that past and the remnants of the past. And like I said, being in law enforcement, having been on the front lines, and having been wanting to be a part of an organization that would say equal justice. But when you're talking about racism in America, I mean, it's just not there. And we as Black law enforcement officers and other officers who recognize it, we owe an oath and a duty to this country and a service to this country to stand up and report it. But yes, you are correct that the disparities are there 100% in just about everything we do.
Thanks a lot. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. Allow me to thank my guests, former Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal Matthew Fogg, joining us from Washington, D.C. Also thanks to Professor of African American Studies at University of Houston, Mr. Gerald Thorne, joining us from Houston, Texas. Also, special thanks to you, our guests, for staying with us on tonight's issue of Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time, everybody. Bye.